The Phoenix Suns coaching search has begun. Monty Williams is gone, and the Suns are not wasting any time finding their next head coach, led by potentially a surprising face in owner Mat Ishbia. On today's episode of Locked On Suns, we'll break down the latest in that search, what we know about who the Suns are looking at, what type of coach they want, and who's running the ship here in Phoenix. Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we're back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 6 seasons. A writer at Suns.com and the host of the Just Basketball Show wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for making Locked On Suns your first listen to start your week. A Monday episode of the show as we are in the first full week of the Suns offseason. Take a deep breath. It's going to be a while, but there's plenty to get to today. Joining me as he does every Monday to help break all of this down is Brendon Dueñas. He is a contributor over at Bright Side of the Sun and our Monday co-host here on Locked On Suns. Before we get to the latest on who the Suns are pursuing, I want to let everybody know today's show is brought to you by Prize Picks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. Okay, Brandon, so let's dive in here. Monty Williams was let go on Saturday night. I gave some preliminary thoughts right after the news broke in a bonus episode for everybody, but there's still tons of layers to this, stuff I didn't get to. What was your reaction when you saw the news come down that they decided to part ways with somebody who you could legit say is one of the most important coaches in Suns history?
Yeah, it was tough. I mean, it didn't really shock me, to be honest. It was something I think we all kind of knew was a distinct possibility, but to actually get that notification, it kind of, hit home a little bit at first, because it's like Monty really did help pull this team out of the gutter. I think, most Suns fans, and it should be all Suns fans, should wish him nothing but the best. Just as a human, I think he's an incredible person, and, he really did help change that culture. But when you have two back-to-back, home blowouts, like the way they went out, there's going to be changes that are made. It's just how the league operates, and especially when you have a new owner coming in trying to make a splash. We saw him trade Mikal Bridges already, so he's not afraid to rip off the Band-Aid. So I think Ishbia is going to be aggressive. He's going to be star hunting for coaches and players, and it's just kind of, I think, a preview of what's to come was that Durant trade literally the day after he took over. So it shouldn't be a surprise, but that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It's kind of a bittersweet moment, and I'm looking forward to see who they end up with and how this whole process plays out.
Yeah, on the Ishbia thing, I think we might have a little bit of a difference of opinion, so I'm looking forward in the next segment to talking through that. I mean, there's a lot we don't know, but some news has come out about all of that behind-the-scenes stuff, courtesy of Woj over the past 24 hours or so since the news came down. But keeping on Monty and where they go next, what we know right now, Brandon, what do you think they need? What do you think Monty didn't have that you would be targeting in his replacement? Because I think that's kind of the place to start. Is we all know Monty's a very good coach, right? Is top half of the league reasonable, even if we might, all not feel exactly the same? I think most of us would agree he's a top half of the league coach, right?
Yeah, for sure. And
so I just want to make sure we're on the same page. So I'm not telling you how to feel or telling the audience how to feel, but you gotta find somebody better then, right? So where would you be looking? What kind of qualities would you be prioritizing in the next guy to be like, okay, he's a step forward?
No, 100%. I think you have to make an upgrade. You can't make a move like this and make a lateral move or even, backtrack. So I think, like I said, I think Ishbia is going to try to seek out the best available options. That just seems like what his entire objective is. He wants to win. So it wouldn't shock me if they pursued someone like a Nick Nurse pretty hard. I think Budenholzer is obviously going to be linked, and we've seen a little bit of Ty Lue connected as well. But that situation gets tricky because you'd have to trade for him since he's under contract still. But I think in terms of needs, it's just going to come down to, and it's really tricky because like we don't even know what their roster looks like right now. So you have to almost project towards what really the basketball operations envision the roster looking like by the time they're done. I don't think you should make a coaching hire based on that alone, but I think it does kind of change the way you want to strategize as far as what type of coach you want. But I think overall, just X's and O's, making in-game adjustments. That's something that someone like a Nick Nurse, he has, he's really been able to muck it up defensively and throw out some pretty interesting schemes. So when I look at what the Suns need specifically, I don't really think offensively, it's not going to be a huge issue as far as like getting Booker and Durant easy looks. I don't think coaching, I don't want to say it doesn't matter offensively, because it certainly does. You want to maximize both those guys. But I think looking at defensive schemes and in-game adjustments, those are the two main things I'm looking at. Because it really, whoever you surround those two guys with, you're going to need to get stops. And that's kind of what we saw against Denver. There's something they couldn't do. And some of that's personnel, some of that's coaching. I'm not trying to blame Monty for that at all, because he really didn't. I think this season got the short end of the stick. But yeah, those are my main two takeaways.
So you lean defense then. Like you would be. It's always hard because I think especially in basketball, I don't always love how it's like, oh, he's an offensive coach. It's like, well, it's not like coordinators in football where they only do one thing, but you would be leaning toward guys who have more of a defensive reputation.
Absolutely. And I think due to the fact that how simple it is to build an offense around Booker and Durant, I think the biggest check mark to me is like, how is this defense going to be a championship level defense? And that's where I lean. That's, to me, it's I don't want to say it's a no-brainer, because I would get if you want to build an offense that just is like Golden State-esque, where it's just like nobody can stop this machine. But at the same time, I think when it comes down to playoff series, and scheming goes both ways, right? Like making adjustments to what defenses throw at you. That's another thing I think will be crucial with two weapons like Booker and Durant.
That's interesting. So I spent the whole show Saturday talking about offense, and I lean that way. And the reason being is I sort of look at it, this is a weird way to put it, because obviously, like you just said, there's uncertainty on this roster. Booker and Durant are the two people who matter the most in this entire organization, I would say, aside from Ishbia, because he owns the team. There's no more important person than that, I suppose, at the end of the day. But I look at it still, and I feel like we've been left with these teams by the end of these playoff runs, watching the Suns, where we watch the role players just come up absolutely empty. And a lot of that to me is offensively, and I would even classify role players as like anyone besides the primary ball handlers. You know what I like? Even DeAndre Ayton, Mikal Bridges, those guys, by the end of some of these playoff series, were just drawing blanks. And so I would like to see a coach come in, and I don't think it's all scheming. I agree with you there. I think it's there's not going to be a lot of complexity. You're not going to be reinventing the wheel to have two great scorers just be efficient. That's not going to be very hard to do, but I do think that there's a certain level of philosophy and just sort of, game plan building and empowering of your players that just wasn't there. And I pointed to what Monty said after a lot of this had wrapped up on Thursday and Friday. He repeated it in various ways of like, we need to, he said, not as 0.5-ish, right? That was the quote that caught my attention. And I think he's right. And I feel like it's crazy to look at an offensive system that was supposed to make those types of guys better. Like that's kind of the point of everybody touching the ball and everybody, becoming involved in one way or another, is that those guys would have a role and would feel empowered. And they very much didn't. But I think that there's something to be said. You look around the league and a lot of teams have very ISO heavy systems or, individual star player systems, and yet the role players still make an impact. They're ready to make an open three when they get it. They're ready to get the offensive rebound, roll to the basket, do whatever. And for whatever reason, those guys are kind of more ready to do that. So I would like to see a coach who can kind of instill those values and philosophies in a way that gets the most out of guys, even if it's just as simple as reinforcing what their role is going to be. I think there's something to be said for that, rather than like, we do this all together and this and that. And it's like, it's really not always what it ends up being in the playoffs. But to get back to the defense, I hear you. And I'll say this, it's a lot easier to find guys that you can get excited about if you're prioritizing defense, because the place I got talking through the offense yesterday is there's just not a lot of guys. There's not a lot of coaches out there that have an offensive pedigree that are available who have championship experience. Budenholzer and Atkinson are probably two. Kenny Atkinson's not coaching Kevin Durant again, I don't think. That's probably not going to happen, and I don't really love the Budenholzer thing.
Yeah, and I think Budenholzer, to me, like him, I know he won a championship, but I think him and Monty are just that's a lateral move to me, really. It's a different voice, and he's an Arizona native, so there's like ties there already, and he was kind of in the mix for that Suns job before he kind of turned them down to go to Milwaukee originally.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember that, but his name popped up.
When they hired Igor, yeah.
Yep, and Woj tweeted out that he was not interested in the job. So, that shows how far we've come now.
Are there, I think.
Yeah, I would say so. But yeah, I think, it makes sense. I think obviously you don't want to overlook offense. Having a system in place is huge, and that kind of is the identity of teams, especially in today's age in the NBA where offense is so important and it's becoming more and more difficult to actually play defense. So, yeah, I think you got to find the best of both worlds, because like you said earlier, it's not like, you advocating for an offensive-minded coach doesn't mean it's like, okay, just, forget defense. Like we're just going to try to outscore you. That's not what that means. It's just about system and philosophy. So for me, it really is tough to like truly narrow down like my top choice without knowing what the roster looks like, which is a cop-out. But that's why I'm going to lean defense with what we have in front of us right now.
Yeah, and like you said, I think Nick Nurse would probably be at the top of that list. I think we're all in agreement that Ty Lue would be a very good candidate if you were able to work something out. I'm hesitant to get too far down that rabbit hole until we have any details. We don't even know if the Clippers would be willing to play ball on something like that. It's sort of just all hypotheticals there. But there's one other aspect of this that I think is interesting that any team would have to figure out that speaks to some of what we're talking about, which is, do you go with a championship pedigree coach? Do you go with somebody with experience and a great reputation, or do you try to look for the next great coach? I think both are valid. It seems like the Suns are leaning experience. We'll talk about that, plus the new details we've gotten from about Mat Ishbia and his role in all of this after one quick break. First, today's show, guys, brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks reinvented daily fantasy. They made daily fantasy great, and now throughout the rest of the NBA playoffs through the finals, one Prize Picks user will win a chance to become a millionaire. One lucky entry placed after 8 a.m. Eastern each day will be randomly selected. Whoever placed that entry will be followed up by getting a 6-pick flex, an additional chart to fill out. 6 correct picks, $1 million. 5 correct, $80,000. 4 correct, $16,000. Full details can be found at prizepicks.com/million, but a reminder, you must opt in at that link. To be eligible, you must submit after 8 a.m. Eastern. And once you do opt in, you put that selection in. That's it. You just play the game like normal, and you could be the lucky winner. If you have not signed up before, download the PrizePicks app now. Go to prizepicks.com, sign up. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code LOCKEDON. So again, download, use the promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will match that right back to your account. That's promo code LOCKEDON at sign up. Make that entry after 8 a.m. Eastern and get a chance to win $1 million. All right, Brandon, so let's pick it up here, and we'll transition into Ishbia from this, but I think part of what's interesting about this whole thing is that I just kind of disagree with the whole idea that the NBA tends to have, that a great team in this position who's making the change from a good coach to somebody who maybe they believe can be a great coach, or a championship coach from a regular season coach, however you want to think about it. I think that there's this belief out there, well, you have to find somebody with just as great of a reputation or just as much pedigree as the last guy, if not more. I just don't really think that that's true at all, honestly. I think you look at LeBron James, twice in his career now, when Ty Lue, who we just talked about, got hired. Ty Lue was the assistant in Cleveland who got promoted. That wouldn't have been anyone with pedigree. I understand he was a former player, but that wouldn't have been looked upon that way. This season in Los Angeles, they hired Darvin Ham, who was an up-and-coming assistant. No experience, no real pedigree. Again, a former player. Maybe that's something of a little bit of a pattern, but not really anybody with a huge something to go off of, right? No real badge of honor or anything that you would say, okay, that guy can get the job done, and yet they have. I mean, we don't know what Darvin Ham will do, but getting to the conference finals in year one is a pretty big accomplishment. There's a ton of examples all around. Kevin Durant, they went from Scott Brooks to Billy Donovan, who was a college coach. Like, it just doesn't hold up to much actual evidence, even though we always tend to assume that that's going to be the case. That being said, the Suns seem to be leaning that direction from everything we've heard so far from Woj and others. Where do you kind of fall on that? Do you feel like it has to be somebody with that experience, or do you think that we could see them look to the next hotshot assistant somewhere who could make a real impact in a different way?
No, I'm with you. I think it really doesn't matter what your track record is, because we've seen that play out where you go for the big name, backfires, and other way around, you go for the up and coming assistant that no one's heard of, and they end up winning coach of the year a year or two down the road. So that's I don't
and the
think
other
that,
way, right? Like I don't want to be like put my head in the sand on it. Like there's plenty of times when they've hired the assistant and it's just been completely terrible. Like that also happens.
Absolutely. So it goes both ways. I don't think there's like a perfect science to it, one way or the other. But I think just based off the quotes we're hearing, and Monty being who he is, I think Ishbia's goal is going to be, and this is just speculation. I could be proven wrong tomorrow, and they make an announcement with who they're hiring. I know it's not going to happen, but he could go after the next up and coming coach. But it seems like they want that big name to offset the the firing and just make a splash. That just kind of seems like what we're going to get. And this is another just complete speculation, unsourced. It wouldn't shock me if you went after some top college coaches either. And just if you start hearing a couple of names, some of the top names in college basketball pop up like in the coming weeks, that's something I could see him doing, just kind of exhausting all options. I think it will be a thorough search. I'm not sure what the end result's going to be and if they're going to make the right move, but I do think that at this point, letting go of Monty was the right call, but that's subject to change, obviously, depending on how things play out.
College coach is an interesting kind of way of thinking about, because the question I was about to ask is, who's a splash? I think Ty Lue, I think getting the job done, getting that across the finish line would certainly qualify as being a splash at the level of getting Durant, right? I mean, like that's obviously been Ishbia's goal here. Mm-hmm. But aside from that, like is Nick Nurse a splash? Like is Frank Vogel, Mike Budenholzer, those guys are all people who just got fired. You know what I mean? It's not exactly sexy to go out and get the guy who a team worse than you in Toronto didn't want, or Milwaukee, guy who lasted one less playoff round than you that forced you to fire your coach. Why would you want that guy? So not that none of those coaches could be great, but I have a hard time understanding like what would qualify to somebody like Mat Ishbia as like a home run hire. That's what's kind of been on my mind, because there's the two guys who you might have thought already went to new teams in Quinn Snyder and Ime Udoka. I think those were the two best guys on the market, but they are already gone. I don't know where he looks. And so maybe you're right. Maybe that makes it more likely that it's something a little bit out of the box.
Yeah, no, that's exactly why I was thinking outside the box, because like you said, there's not a ton of splashes. I do think Nick Nurse would probably just in the NBA community in general fall under like, let's just say a little ripple, not a split, maybe not full on wave, but it'd be a hire that you could talk me into.
I mean, he's the guy who's kind of popping up the most. So even just being able to kind of say like, we got him and other teams also wanted him, but he came here. Like you could kind of flex that, I guess.
Yeah. And I think Ty Lue would be to me, that's my favorite by far if they could somehow make that happen, but it's going to be tough when you don't have the draft pick, the draft picks to make a trade for him like that, then you start trying to think of, what's going to actually make a deal happen. Because Ballmer, that guy's crazy. He'll probably try to do, if Ty Lue is on the block, he'll probably try to one up Ishbia and make it, an even bigger splash. So I'm just very curious to see what this coaching carousel ends up like. And some of the names that are going to drop in like the next couple days, weeks, who knows how long this will take. But like I said, if they go after if you start to hear like, some big name coaches out there in the college world pop up, that's something I think we could see pretty soon.
If you're Jalen Rose, the big splash is Steve Kerr. that came out on ESPN's pregame show today that Jalen Rose said to keep an eye on that. I think if Steve Kerr is leaving the Warriors, he's probably just retiring from coaching.
Yeah.
He's not exactly a young guy at this point. He's done plenty in basketball. I mean, he's 57. It's not like he's at the end of the road, but I don't know what he has left to prove that coming to Phoenix and trying to coach Durant again and all that would accomplish for him. I think that was just a little bit of trying to get some attention is what it felt like.
Yep.
Doc Rivers, how do you feel?
No, thank you. That would just be, that he's had a lot of opportunities that he's squandered. So I don't know if he's the right guy to push a team over the hump that's, struggling to get that last win or that closeout win. So he would not be very high on my list. And I also want to shout out Kevin Young real quick because
I was just going to ask you about him. What do you think of that? Because that's sort of the best of both worlds. In some ways, it's familiarity, but it's also potentially that next hotshot guy. Yeah,
I don't think it'll happen. I think it's more of just something that it's out of respect because he's going to get a job. It's a matter of, when, not if. But will that be with the Suns? Will that be replacing Monty? Are you going to be able to sell that to your fan base? Which I would be fine. Like if that's their option after interviewing, 5 or 6 candidates, they end up with Kevin Young like that. To me, I would be fine with that because I do think that he has that in him to be a high level head coach at the next level. But at the same time, I just can't see Ishbia selling that to the fan base just in general. It seems like he's more about making an impression and getting someone that the players respect immediately, that has that track record, like you mentioned. That's kind of what we've seen from all these reporters. So I don't think I don't want to say he's just like a token interview, but it's almost like they're throwing his name in there because of what he's done, and they know that he has that ability.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. My last thing on Nurse to return there is if I'm listing off the coaches who are maybe the most creative or adventurous, especially on the defensive end of the floor, I think that he definitely takes the cake there. I think he hasn't led a top 10 offense that didn't include Kawhi Leonard. I don't feel like he's very imaginative on the offensive side of things. I think that, honestly, as I've looked at that roster over the years, I felt like they're getting less than the sum of its parts out of it at times. And reading the tea leaves or trying to make sense of it based on some of the reporting you hear is like, maybe some of that is actually because he didn't get along with his players. Like there was Pascal Siakam had a bunch of stuff a while back, and that's boiled over. But then OG Anunoby, has had apparently some frustration, and guys are playing a ton of minutes, and the young players don't always get opportunities. Like it doesn't feel like the best environment to throw onto a new team with high expectations. So I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of with you. I really don't know where this is headed. I hope we get some more information to at least know kind of who was considered. I would hate it if it was just a surprise hire, because I think this is a really interesting opportunity to kind of learn what Mat Ishbia is thinking here. On that note, let's transition to him. Again, Woj reporting in as strong terms as taken over. Mat Ishbia has taken over the Suns organization. What does that mean, and what are the other priorities that apparently Ishbia will be tasked with solving for this Suns team? We'll talk about all that after one more quick break. Okay, closing out the show here, Brandon, I think you tweeted something to the effect of that you basically trusted the vision that Ishbia had. After we heard from Woj that there was a very strong influence, if not outright, just sort of like top-down, whatever you want to call it, happening, where Ishbia is leading the way on all this stuff, that you trusted it. That feels very optimistic to me because I don't love the idea of an over-involved owner. Maybe I'm scarred from Arizona, being an Arizona sports fan in a variety of aspects, but tell me what your read on that is, that Ishbia was the one to pull the trigger, as you mentioned, on the KD trade, giving up Bridges, and now on a coaching switch.
Yeah, so let me hopefully talk some fans off the ledge if you are feeling that way, because the first thing I do when reports like that come out is I think about what the motive of that, like who leaked that, like why would they leak that? Why is that coming out? That's not coming from the Suns. Woj was wrong about the whole Durant situation. So to me, I don't really look at that report. I don't take it for what it's worth, because I don't think there's a ton of substance there. And first off, second, I look at Ishbia right now. Obviously, you're a new owner. You have a new team. You want to make the right impression with your fan base and everything. But I think at the end of the day, if you're the owner, you want to have full control. You want to have your people that you trust in place. So to me, this initial launch into ownership, I think it's more about him finding that steady balance of appeasing the fan base, but also getting his people that he trusts. And once he has that in place, I'm hoping he takes a step back and just lets those people do their jobs, because that's what a good owner does. And I think we already know he wants to win based off everything he said. I don't think there's an owner out there that wants to lose. But his over involvement, I think the whole Sarver situation kind of got into Suns fans' heads, and that's fair. And I'm typically a pessimistic person myself, but I think once he gets his guys in, I doubt it's going to be one of those micromanaging situations. I do think he'll have a say on major moves, obviously, but when it comes to like the basketball operations and trusting who he puts in place, that's key, because that's what Sarver towards the end of his tenure took a step back, and you saw the results play out almost immediately. So hopefully Ishbia, I think he's smart enough guy to know that, hire these people to do a job, sit back and watch a team win.
I mean, I think that's all completely relevant and possible. I mean, I think that, to me, at the end of the day, it makes sense, even if it doesn't feel great in the moment to watch it play out. It obviously makes sense that if you're taking over any sort of company, you would slowly over time determine what level of trust you have in the people around. And if that's not high enough for you, go about replacing them, right? Like, you even look at, it's kind of like a little bit of the inverse here, where in the mortgage company that he runs, Ishbia started to hire basketball people because he trusted them. He had relationships with them, and that business has succeeded, in at least financially. In this case, I'm not saying he's going to bring mortgage people to basketball. It won't be like that, but I just mean that evolution is reasonable. It's just hard for me to look at the success that came before him and just how quick of a trigger he seems to have here already, because it was working. It was already running on all cylinders to a degree, and so to feel like that anything needed to change bigger than just the coach, we'll see. Do you think James Jones' job is safe for now? I mean, I think you would fire Jones first if you were going to make a move like that. I think he at least has one more year. Does that feel right?
Yeah, no, I think that would have been a package deal if they probably both would have been let go at the same time. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to have him tell Monty he's fired and then fire him after that. That's just bad blood around the league. And I think Jones has done a great job rebuilding the player, relationships as far as like with the front office. So I think keeping him around at least for another year makes sense. But,
do you think there's any chance that if that's the case in his Woj went so far as to say like his influence is waning? Like, it's not just that Ishbia has been really hands-on, it's that it feels like some part of that is that Ishbia is being, or that Jones is sort of being boxed out of this thing. Do you think there's any chance that he quits?
I wouldn't rule it out if it hit a certain point to where he feels like he doesn't have, the same level of control. But right now, I think his job's safe long-term? Absolutely not. I don't think it should be, to be honest. I think he's done a overall, like, same with Monty. I think they've both done a great job, and I thank them for helping right the ship and really establish a culture. But I don't think his job will be safe if the Suns have the same roster construction issues heading into, this time next season. If it's another second round exit, I highly doubt he'll be back. But but I do trust him in terms of, if the right pieces are around and he has all the resources possible to build a championship roster, I think he can. But it really just comes down to how much freedom Ishbia gives him. So that's really the main question. It's tough these things are all speculation, because we really don't know what goes on behind the scenes, and we're just hearing one version of it.
Speaking of the one version, so you said you don't think that came from the Suns. Do you think Ishbia leaked that he's in control?
I doubt it.
Well, then where did it come from? What Woj said on ESPN, it was incredibly urgent. So like he was like, this is Ishbia's ship now. He's the captain now. So where do you think that came from?
Well, so it would make sense if Ishbia was trying to deflect that off of James Jones in terms of he was the one that made the decision, kind of like taking the heat from that perspective, it would make sense. But in terms of,
but they wrote the press release that it was James Jones' decision. That's what's so strange about this.
So that's why I'm saying that dots don't really connect there. And I'm just curious where that, because if it didn't come from Ishbia, that leak doesn't
feels
make
sense. So I think it makes sense to maybe parse what it means to say the Suns, right? Because I would say the most likely source of something like that is Jones and his representation.
Mm-hmm. Or Monty,
right?
possibly.
I think that's probably where you would guess that that's coming from, or somebody in the current front office who feels that boxing out happening.
Yep.
Maybe that it doesn't even, it's not so much to like save themselves to be like, oh, we wouldn't have fired Monty. I don't know if it's even about Monty. I think it might just be a vibe that they've been getting since he took over, and a feeling that like we sort of need to protect ourselves and distance ourselves and just sort of make it clear what's going on around here to people, you know? But you're right. I mean, it is interesting to have it happen where it's like, well, if it's not about any one move, then why are they trying to save their reputations? And I don't know. I don't know necessarily. It's interesting, but usually Woj doesn't come out that aggressively. Usually he is a sort of walking press release. And in this case, he had some actual juice and he wanted to share it in an article that got adjusted. And then when Greeny asked him about it pregame. So he very clearly had a message to deliver. I guess we'll see where it came from. We were going to talk about other priorities. Let me just ask it to you in one question, and we'll have plenty of time to continue to talk about it as the offseason goes along. But what is now that the coach situation is moving forward, obviously they're going to have a new coach. Beyond that, what is your number one priority for putting the Suns in a better position to win a championship next season compared to what they were this year?
Pretty much just players 3 through 8, because you have an 8-man rotation in the playoffs. What are those, instead of just going for straight up depth, like, where Jones will go for the 15 deep type team. I just want to see this team have 7 or 8 rotation players that fit as well as you can around Booker and Durant, high end role players, 3 and D players, having a little bit more, I think, punch off the bench offensively too. Could alleviate some scoring issues, but overall it's just about who are you going to surround these two guys with, and it comes down to what you're going to get back in a potential Ayton trade. Is Ayton a part of their plans now that Monty's gone? That's another angle to look at. It seems like a lot of fans have mentally moved on from him and Chris Paul. That doesn't mean they're both gone, but at this point it really just is about putting the best complementary pieces around Booker and Durant, and there's a lot of different avenues they can take. It is complex. It's not going to be easy, whether they want to go the route of adding a third star or using that to just improve the starting lineup, which I think having a high-end starting lineup is a little bit more important than just one star, because we've seen how the Brooklyn situation went. So there's certain players I think that are worth taking that risk for, but I don't know. It's going to be a fascinating offseason to watch for sure.
I would, if I had to pick one specific thing, I would probably say nailing the Chris Paul next chapter.
Yep. It's huge.
There's a lot of different things you can do. Like you said, there's different pathways. His salary and the guarantees on it, which it's like half guaranteed, that's one complicating factor. I think a complicating factor that doesn't get talked about enough is it's one thing to move on from Chris Paul, but who is the next player to play his position? It's not just like an easy, okay, get rid of him, get some stuff back. It's like, well, if that stuff isn't a point guard, well, then who's playing point guard? Is Booker doing that full time? Like, then you open up more questions for yourself. So I think having a coherent plan and executing that is probably number one, because as much as the Ayton thing, I think we're all sort of expecting he could very well be traded. it's not necessary right now because he's under contract for a while. The Chris Paul thing, it's right now. You know, you got to do it because you have to roll over that asset. You can't let him become a free agent next summer. So either, you know, maybe there's a world where they keep him. I kind of doubt that. If they don't keep him, or if they do keep him, then extend him at the very least. Keep that contract going. If they don't, then nail the trade and find the point guard of the future. You have to. The time is now on that asset. The clock is ticking and the alarm's about to go off. Like you have to act now and you have to get it right because the margin for error is just too narrow with this roster. We haven't even talked about the CBA. Like I've barely talked about the CBA on this show, partially because I don't fully get the whole breadth of everything that's going to be knocking them on their you-know-what, but the Suns are going to be one of the hardest teams hit, so all these decisions are even more important. So that would be number one on my list, but as we'll talk about in the coming weeks, there's no shortage of other things on that list. That'll wrap us up, though, guys. Appreciate you listening to start out your week as the Suns offseason begins in full force. You can read Brandon over at Bright Side of the Sun. This show will be back tomorrow. The everydayers can look out for a new show, probably more coaching news, more off-season stuff, maybe a little more clarity on what in the world Woj was talking about. We'll catch that tomorrow. I'll talk to you guys then.